Well, one, I just think that the stories of our ancestors and the stories, fairy tales that were crafted that all have a lesson at the heart are important to remember. And I think they're still relevant today. Specifically in Me Moth, Sani and Moth both had very similar ways of looking at the world, of the universe, their ancestors, and the respect they had for it. And it really just made sense. But for me, as a person who practices hoodoo, if I'm not putting history or ancestry in my story, it just doesn't work. I think that storytelling predates the written word by thousands of years. The stories that our families have told us, and the stories that get passed down, and then the stories, like, for example, for Navajo the Dene, like, I just talked to my aunt, and some of these stories aren't written down. Like, these are stories that are, if you're not part of that community, oh well. And there were stories in that one specifically which I didn't share because it wasn't something that was for open conversation. And so the magic of that, the magic of being the only written, or your history being an oral one, is beautiful to me. And then also for fairy tales, we're also good at smiling. I think that we often see fairy tales as childish, the way that we branded them today, as for children, but fairy tales really are almost like fables that are teaching us lessons that we need to carry on or remember. And I think that whether it's Baba Yaga, whether it's Anansi the spider who says, be careful for witty people, like, they're all telling you something. And I think that for me as a child, having access to these stories, they taught me so much more about life than life did sometimes. And I thought that for Whimsy, whose grandmother in the book practiced hoodoo and who was like, no, fae people are real, like this magical undertone in the world is real, they were really important to Whimsy. And I think that they were the things that fortified her. And so in this garden, they were the things that she encountered. But yeah, I think that stories and fairy tales in particular carry history in a different way. I think that fairy tales, Zora Neale Hurston said, who was a folklorist, she said that fairy tales carry the history of the people. And history is like the history of the oppressor, or whoever won. And I love the idea that the history of the people are stories that we know that we're supposed to extract meaning from. So yeah, that's why generally there is some sort of, I'm working on a fantasy series and it's still using history and stories within it because they're what make the world go round to me. Yeah.
Yeah, and they also record part of the, because it's really interesting to look at different layers of fairy tales or different versions, because a lot of them have been Christianized.
Right.
And so they've been, like aspects of them have been demonized. I'm thinking about Baba Yaga, who wasn't like a negative character at the beginning.
Right.
And also the idea, because, I also work in shamanism or a form of shamanism. And so the idea that fae, like those beings are real and part of the world, that's not just an idea, like it's real.
Yes.
Absolutely real. It's part of it. And they're also part of our ancestry, depending on people.
Yeah.
Not everybody has like ancestry that's out of this world, but
it is, no.
But it's true, like it's real. And so I think it's really important to have that be present. And I just really liked the way that you wove that into your writing and into your characters, and how deep I felt your understanding of, I guess, the essence of those characters and those stories was. I could really feel it. Like it felt very strongly. It felt very present to me as I was reading the text. That's partly why I was so excited about the book, because I was like, oh my God, somebody who can feel it. It was like, I could feel the embodied understanding of those stories through your writing.
Thank you so much. That was that was the goal. That was the hope that that would happen. And it's interesting that you would say that, because for this book, I did my audiobook for Me Moth, and I did it for this one. And for this one, it was one of the hardest things I've done, because I wanted my voice to be a little bit different for each character. Each, Baba Yaga can't sound like Nancy the spider. They're different. And so like, I'm not an actress. So like, it was more of like sitting like with those characters. And I remember I would know which character I wanted to do, and they would record and have like a sound bite. So like next time I came back to it, I remember like I could do that. But like, yes, I think that every fairy tale in the garden and in general has an essence about them that runs so deep, because that story has been told by so many people. But the essence or the power that they bring to the page is what I wanted to get at. When you only have so much space, when you could write 1,000 pages on each of these people, the essence or the strength that they bring when they're on the page is really what I was trying to embody. So like you saying that, thank you very much. I really was trying to make that happen.
Yeah, well, you succeeded.
Thank you.
That's why I was so excited. And I thought immediately, I was like, oh my God, I need to get her on the podcast. And I had no idea how to do that. And then it just happened. So it's just great.
I'm glad it worked out. I'm really glad it worked out, because everything you're talking about, like when you were talking about, there is a fae people, like all these things, I believe that like if I went on a regular podcast and said, people would be like, Amber, are you serious? Yes, I'm serious. Goodness.
Absolutely serious.
But yeah, I mean, I also live in the area. I live in the country, like on 20 something acres. So like I'm in the Appalachian kind of area, which is a whole thing as well. And my dog passed away last year, but I had a German Shepherd for 13 years. And when we went on night walks, the things that we would see, and I'd be like, let's just, maybe it's time to turn around. Like, I think that when you're very connected, I do think that certain people just don't have access to certain things. And I think that it's just like tuning into a radio station. Some people are tuned in, some people aren't. And I do think that I do have this very deep belief that pets are like almost a very centering thing, because they just work in their instincts so much. And I feel like whenever I do feel disconnected a bit more ever since my dog passed away. But like definitely a huge part of my life as well. And I definitely believe in everything that you were touching on. Yeah.
Yeah. And you definitely get, you're more or less connected, also depending on how magical your ancestry is, how there's like a number of things that happen that make you more or less connected. And definitely pets can also make you more connected in the way that they're, like a familiar, if you will, and they will kind of protect you also, so that you have more ability to see and to be aware, because you have more protection as well.
Yes.
So there's all that aspect. But talking about magic, would you talk a little bit about hoodoo? Because I don't, like I'm very, I'm more like on the Nordic shamanism side with my ancestry. Yeah. So I'm actually really curious about.
I think that what's beautiful about Nordic, African American, Scottish, like all of that, is that there is this deep seated respect of nature in all of these. But hoodoo specifically is an African American folk magic system. So when enslaved Africans were stolen from Africa, they weren't allowed to practice their own beliefs anymore. It was illegal. They would be killed or beaten for it. And so Christianity was forced on them. And so a lot of African Americans, enslaved African Americans, mixed together the traditions of West Africa with Christianity in this tradition that was called hoodoo or root work. And basically, it's this deep connection with ancestors, so that when things are not going your way, or you're down or you're sick, the ancestors are there to support you. And one of the strongest aspects of hoodoo, which made it so dangerous, where some practitioners were, specifically in like the 1940s and 30s, arrested for practicing, is that there is no good or bad. It's balance. So if someone harmed you in a way that your enslaver would, nothing that you do would be unfair. to put our wish on them. And I think that there's a strength in that, of this idea that good and bad, no, there's balance. There's what people do to you and then how you can react to it. But it works a lot in plants. It's a closed system. So a lot of it is you have to find your own teacher. And, but I guess the more surface level is that it works with herbs and offerings to connect with your ancestors, to receive messages and guidance, and also strength. And also they can work within the spirit world to tilt the odds in your favor, to help you get through any sickness or someone who's blocking your path. Outside of that, practitioners have spell work and rituals that involve a bit more things like bones and things like that get into it, to help people who don't necessarily practice, but to give them that same protection. So it works a lot in magic and ritual and ancestors. And it's something that I've always known about. My grandfather, when he passed away, he's from South Carolina, and that's a huge hub for hoodoo and root work. But it wasn't until about 5 or 6 years ago that I actively, I guess my parents always said I was the witch in our family. But I didn't realize that a lot of things, it's so interesting, ancestry, that I was doing were hoodoo until I started researching it, because I never felt connected to witchcraft. It was more of, it was something, I didn't have a word for it. It was just what I practiced. And so when I found that and really researched and found my own, teacher, elder to help me, the world really started to open up. And a lot of things started to make sense. So it's a really profound practice, and it changes. In the United States, it's so big. Based on where you live in the United States, it's a little different. New Orleans hoodoo is a little bit different than Virginia or South Carolina hoodoo. And it's really, I'm working on a nonfiction book, because I do think a lot of African Americans don't even know about it, and they don't have access to it, because that history was something that was hidden and you got punished for. And so I just want more people to know they have a very strong connection to their ancestors, and they can have access to it. Yeah.